I think a lot of the bigger companies like Adobe, like Nvidia, are looking at this and saying this is the future of VFX, really. I think what is changing is what is deemed to be sufficiently reliable evidence to make that claim. I mean, yeah, the future will be synthesized, right? That's kind of my kind of cheesy phrase I like to say. Is that, yeah, this stuff isn't going away. This is going to happen.
Herzlich willkommen bei Digitale Optimisten. Ich bin Alex und ich bin in diesem Podcast immer noch auf der Suche nach den Elon Musks von morgen, die bahnbrechende Ideen haben, genau wie der Chef von Tesla und SpaceX, aber damit eben noch nicht so groß sind, sondern noch ganz am Anfang stehen. Diesen Satz sage ich eigentlich so oder so ähnlich, so gut wie in jeder Folge. Manchmal rede ich aber auch mit Leuten, die ich einfach interviewen muss, weil sie absolute Experten sind in einem Bereich, der mich dann zu dieser Zeit besonders interessiert. Ich missbrauche dann sozusagen meinen Podcast hier, um für mich ganz persönlich die Dinge besser zu verstehen, die unsere Zukunft und damit ja auch das Umfeld für Unternehmertum prägen werden. Deshalb ist die Folge heute etwas ganz Besonderes, denn ich rede mit einem der größten Experten auf diesem Gebiet über ein Thema, das ich grenzenlos faszinierend finde. Das Themengebiet heißt Deepfakes und der Experte Ende. Henry stellt sich gleich selbst vor, nur so viel, er ist auf der ganzen Welt von der New York Times bis zum Guardian für seine Meinung gefragt. Deshalb erlaubt mir eine ganz kurze Intro zum Thema Deepfakes. Deepfakes wird auch Synthetic Media genannt, also am Computer erzeugte nicht reale Tonaufnahmen oder Videoaufzeichnungen, die so täuschend echt sind, dass man sie nur sehr schwer als Fake erkennen kann. Du kennst vielleicht ein paar Beispiele, die in der Vergangenheit viral gegangen sind, wenn zum Beispiel Barack Obama Donald Trump einen Vollidioten nennt oder Mark Zuckerberg sagt, dass ihm die Privatsphäre seiner Nutzer egal ist. Die Beispiele findest du auch auf digitaleoptimisten.de/podcast/Henry, wenn du dir mal ein eigenes Bild davon machen willst, was das genau ist. Aktuell kann man diese Deepfakes noch ganz gut als Fake erkennen, aber du kannst dir vorstellen, was für eine ungeheure Wirkung das hätte, wenn man es eben nicht mehr erkennt. Was ist dann überhaupt noch real? Wem traut man noch? Interessanterweise reden wir aber in diesem Gespräch auch über die positiven Seiten von Deepfakes. Ich finde ein hochspannendes Gespräch, auf das ich mich schon lange im Voraus gefreut habe. Wie immer, wenn dir dieser Podcast gefällt, dann erzähl doch bitte einer weiteren Person in deinem Freundes- oder Bekanntenkreis davon in dieser Woche. Meine 3 Learnings stelle ich am Ende der Folge vor. Aber jetzt erstmal rein ins Gespräch mit Ende. Henry, welcome to Digitale Optimisten. Where are you located at the moment?
Hey, I'm currently in a nice community town called Harpenden, just north of London.
Nice. You are the first person that I am interviewing from the UK, which is great. I've had people from all over the world, but weirdly not out of London. Great that we're changing that. And the great thing is that it's not anybody that I'm talking to. I'm talking to, what I feel is one of the most renowned experts on a topics that I have been trying to corner for quite some time. Deepfakes. You have appeared on BBC, Sky, Vox, Financial Times, The Guardian, and in the New York Times, even in the Rolling Stone. I thought only rock stars make it to the Rolling Stone. And I had to wonder, are you even a little bit nervous appearing on this podcast, Henry? Be honest.
Not especially, Alex, but that's entirely due to my confidence in you as an exceptional host. That's my faith in you that's inspiring that.
Wonderful. And it's really cool that you made it to the Rolling Stone. That must up your street cred for quite something, no?
Yeah, I think when I was younger, I was thinking maybe that'd be me in the next big rock band. But perhaps discussing the problem of deepfake pornography and K-pop singers is a way that I was less imagining. But it was an interesting feature to do for sure.
Absolutely. Great. So, Henry, let's dive right into the topic that I feel we have a ton of material to talk about. First off, let's really ease ourselves into this discussion. Let's also broaden and introduce this topic to all our listeners. We will be talking about the topic of deepfakes. What are deepfakes?
Yeah, so for an opening question, that's one that's a bit cryptic in some respects, but I'll do my best to give you a kind of succinct answer there. So deepfakes can be broadly understood as AI generated media. That is the deep from deep learning, and fake is in obviously something which isn't real, is deceptive. And so deepfakes are fundamentally the use of these kinds of algorithms, deep learning algorithms in particular, to generate in an automated fashion from a training data set of real images, videos, audio, a synthetic kind of replica of, say, someone's face, someone's voice, someone's body movements, even. Or potentially to alter those aspects of a person. So, for example, synchronizing their lip movements to a new audio track, or using a deepfake puppetry technique to recreate my facial movements in someone else's digital avatar. And so deepfakes refer to these wide range of synthetic medias that are now made possible due to advances with artificial intelligence over the last 5 years or so. There is some debate over whether the term should refer explicitly to malicious uses of the technology, in part because the term was first coined exclusively to refer to the use of face swapping non-consensually into pornographic footage with celebrities. And obviously the term has since expanded in what people use it for, but it has remained kind of a negative term, which has got that connotation with its initial use case. So some people would say perhaps deepfakes are exclusively for malicious uses, but it's far from set in stone.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about both sides of this. But basically, to wrap up what you said, I mean, doctoring images, making something appear on a photograph that hasn't been there. I mean, that goes back to forever. I remember that, who was it, Stalin or Lenin? He removed some people from photographs who, kind of were discredited during the curse of whatever happened. So when we're talking about deepfakes, we're basically expanding this, photoshopping not to images, but to videos.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, deepfakes can include images. So, one of the most famous or most notorious uses of deepfakes is actually to generate entirely synthetic people who don't exist, and can also be used in other contexts, such as what are called selective small edits, where you could, use an algorithm to selectively remove or add aspects as you would with Photoshop, but in a highly automated and scalable manner. But absolutely right. This is building on a tradition of media manipulation that's existed since photography has existed, right? As you said, Stalin, notorious for editing out dissenting individuals and people that lost his favor. And there are famous cases of photoshopping up until the present day. The difference is deepfakes create a whole new category of manipulated media that previously was just not possible, and has only become possible in a sense of highly accessible tools. Due to these advances with specific types of deep learning and neural networks.
Can you give us some examples of, I do recall some of those deepfakes going viral in the past, and I suspect that these are going to be going more viral and more of these cases going viral in the future. But might have someone come across such a deepfaked piece of media?
Sure. So, I mean, you're absolutely right that there have been quite a few examples now since late 2017 when deepfakes first emerged of kind of viral examples, and a lot of memes more recently as deepfake apps have become more popular. But the most kind of notorious trend, I guess, was what were called derp fakes or cage fakes back in early 2018, where people started using face swapping to put Nicolas Cage into a wide range of different films in increasingly absurd positions. And so that became a bit of a meme trend at first. But now we've seen obviously more recently the Tom Cruise deepfake, which was viral on TikTok. And that deepfake was highly sophisticated. That was not an easy deepfake to make. Was created by a leading professional creator and was involving a Tom Cruise impersonator. But nonetheless, we're seeing, especially on platforms like TikTok, an increasing amount of creators who specialize purely in making kind of deepfake memes to go viral. There's one, for example, an account that does deepfakes of Putin in increasingly ridiculous circumstances. Same on YouTube, putting Trump into many different silly positions, such as a crying baby. No celebrity is now immune from being deepfaked in these kind of memes. And indeed, a lot of the apps that are now popular that do deepfaking have licensed celebrities' images, so you can swap your face into famous films that they are in, or you can swap your face with theirs, so that you can become, Leonardo DiCaprio or The Rock or something like this.
Wow. So if you always wanted to be a star of Titanic, that might actually be something that is in store for you in the future. Okay, so there are a couple of examples, mostly in the meme culture. We're going to talk about some other examples as well. But how big are deepfakes? How much of a thing is it? Is there any way to, I'm not sure if you can quantify it, but why are we talking about deepfakes? And why is the New York Times writing about this? Why are you a guest in Financial Times? What's the big number here that we're looking at?
Yeah, so in terms of actually kind of mapping the deepfake landscape, as you could say, that's something that I've been working on now for about 3 years. First at the world's first deepfake detection startup called Deeptrace, now called Sensity, where I was head of intelligence and research there. And we published a study that I was the lead author and researcher on in 2019 that found, perhaps unsurprisingly for us researchers, but quite shockingly, I think, to the general public, that 96% of deepfakes at the time were pornographic. And almost all of these are of women. And again, it's safe to say that basically all of them are non-consensual as well. So that was a really stark reminder for us, but also a massive shock for the general public that deepfakes are vastly used in malicious ways. And indeed, this was something that the media were quite shocked to hear about. And as the technology has continued to evolve and become more sophisticated, become more accessible in a lot of ways, so when deepfakes were first being used in late 2017 and early 2018, they were using very hard to kind of use open source programs, where you typically had to be a computer programmer to actually make it work effectively and customize it to get better results. Now, a lot of these tools are behind friendly user interfaces. They are being turned into apps or web apps. And so as the technologies become more accessible and the more sophisticated, people have become more concerned of other use cases in areas such as cybersecurity, so impersonation for fraud, using synthetic voice audio to clone a CEO's voice to impersonate them, requesting money from a subsidiary or something like this. Also increasingly concerned about, for example, disinformation, how this could feed into existing uses of media manipulation to really enhance the kinds of manipulation that fool people and could potentially have catastrophic impacts on political events, for example. And then I think, of course, it is really important to emphasize that, non-consensual image abuse or deepfake pornography, but I think image abuse is a more neutral phrase here to use, is hugely traumatizing for the women who are targeted. And so I think, when you're looking at a technology which fundamentally gives increasing numbers of people the ability to manipulate reality, as it increasingly is for us in our digital world, that comes with immense opportunities for perhaps creative and commercial uses, but also immense potential for bad actors to weaponize it and to cause immense harm to different people or organizations.
Yeah, and you are kind of opening up the book on deepfakes there. I mean, we're going to dive into many of these topics in our discussion. Before we do, what I would love to understand is, how did you personally get involved in this topic? Because, I mean, as you mentioned, it's not a topic that has been around forever, but is now gaining steam and a lot of attraction. How did you get into the topic of deepfakes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so my background academically is in philosophy. And during my master's, I started to specialize particularly in philosophy of perception. So looking at the nature of conscious experience, looking at certain visual and auditory experiences in regards to hallucinations and illusions, and looking fundamentally at how we can build philosophical frameworks to explain abnormal perceptual experiences. And at the same time, I was doing my master's in Cambridge, where there's a center called the Center for the Future of Intelligence. And this is an AI think tank based out of the university that does a lot of work looking at future threats that AI pose. And naturally, having conversations with some of the people there, deepfakes came up as a topic. And my research from those very early days in late 2017 meant I saw firsthand this stuff emerging on Reddit as well. And so this was a natural point of kind of a synthesis for me, no pun intended, where, you know, my study of philosophy as a kind of a framework for understanding new and difficult ideas and concepts matched nicely this interest in how artificial intelligence was requiring us, in a lot of cases, to reevaluate how we framed the world, how we thought about the world, and how we interacted with the content that we consumed. And so it was a very kind of natural space for me to start researching and understanding the future potential of.
So you wrote your PhD on this topic, is that right?
No, so I was my master's, and I actually didn't formally write any research on this during my master's. I was working on some fairly abstract stuff on the metaphysics of cross-modal perception. But what I was doing during my master's was researching this as kind of like a side interest. And following my master's, I went on to work for an organization called Nest, which is an innovation think tank in London, where I wrote the first kind of internal report on deepfakes as a kind of a first lay of the land mapping before going on to work for Sensity, the deepfake detection company.
Yeah. Interesting how this kind of side interest of yours kind of spun out into something that is now much bigger than what it intended to be. Before we because I think this is the meaty part of our conversation, is going to be really the positive and negative sides of deepfakes, to really wrap our head around it. You mentioned that one characteristic of deepfakes is that it's, there's a very unique way to produce it. You even mentioned that, there was even an actor involved with the Tom Cruise deepfake that was making the rounds on TikTok earlier this year. But what does it, and also you mentioned that it's becoming much easier now. There's also apps out there that can just do basically simple things like swap out faces. But how do you produce deep fakes? Because I believe that there's something out there where, as you mentioned, you don't even need programming skills. It's something, an easy deep fake is something that almost anyone can do out of their smartphone, or even more, no?
Absolutely. So, I mean, my background, having studied philosophy, is not technical. I am not a computer scientist nor a programmer. And yet I can still, through a variety of different tools, create some fairly basic deepfakes, predominantly in the area of face swapping and facial reenactment. And so, yeah, as I mentioned, deepfakes have rapidly commodified over the last few years. By which I mean technology which was originally open source code, which was put together through libraries like TensorFlow, which was coming out of academic and industry research. I think a lot of those researchers realized the commercial potential of the tool, of the technology, and B, creative hobbyists online who are not all looking to maliciously use this technology, but are just fascinated by it and want to test how much they can do with it, started to turn it into something which was much more user-friendly. And so while the Tom Cruise deepfake content is still really hard to create, whilst that content is incredibly hard to create and requires a lot of post-production work to actually make the raw deepfake look good, we're talking about smartphone apps such as Zao in China, or Reface, or Impressions in the West, that provide increasingly impressive face swapping capabilities, actually, and also with a very little amount of data, because they pre-train these models on specific scenes from films, for example. All you need is really one photo to get a fairly decent face swap. But also tools like Avatarify or Wombo more recently, which are about using a model called first order motion, which essentially kind of manipulates a still image with someone else's mouth movements or facial movements. And those, again, are not realistic. They're not high quality, but they're showing glimpses of what's coming next as the technology matures, as more and more people recognize the commercial potential of the technology. And so, these tools are becoming increasingly accessible. There are still some tools which are open source, which are a bit more complicated to use, that render much better results. But we're talking there about needing to have pretty good GPU capacity. We're talking about having to learn how to use that properly, and they're still not particularly user-friendly. So high-quality deepfakes are still out of reach for the vast majority of people, but they are getting increasingly close. And that's, I think, a theme that we'll probably discuss later as well, is this increasing move towards accessibility and commercialization.
Mm-hmm. So let's dive right in. I mean, let's start with the positive end of deepfakes, because this does not have to be a simply malicious technology that is just used to harm people or to do extortion or blackmailing people. It's more about, there's also some positive sides to it. What are some of those positive angles to deepfakes?
Yeah, so I think this is a side of the conversation which is perhaps neglected and perhaps understandably neglected based on the vast amount of malicious use cases which are feared and in some cases already being deployed. And I think it is worth saying that the positive use cases, I think, could be convincingly argued to be significantly less than the malicious ones. Having said that, I think it is important that we consider them, and we accept that this technology is not going away. And in some cases, we don't want it to go away because it does have utility. I think I'd break your question down just a bit further and say, well, what are the kind of societally beneficial use cases and what are the kind of commercially beneficial use cases? Because I think some people would argue, it's important to draw that distinction. In the societally beneficial use cases, one of the most kind of poignant uses is to create synthetic voices for people who have lost the ability to speak that retain their character and actually their identity. So if you think about Stephen Hawking, when he lost the ability to speak, I imagine that was probably sometime in maybe the 70s or the 80s. He got an American robot voice effectively, which was not like how he sounded before he lost that ability to speak. Whereas now there are companies that are working on that synthetic voice technology to create entirely customized, bespoke, personalized synthetic voices, which provide people with a real sense of personality in the face of extreme adversity. And so I think that's one of the most powerful use cases, which is people with degenerative diseases regaining their voice in an incredibly traumatic set of circumstances. There's also another case when it comes to accessibility, which is using generative adversarial networks, or GANs, which is a specific kind of neural network, to create synthetic sign language directly from audio. So you play a piece of audio, and from the back of that audio, you generate a person signing, so that someone who is deaf can consume that content. So I think that's another really powerful use case, which again shows what the technology can do if used in good faith.
It's interesting that you say that. If I just interject there for a second, because it is striking now that you say it, that Stephen Hawking has relied on that voice since his situation worsened as it did. So he never really changed the voice. He did that technology was there all along. But what you're saying is, with deepfakes, it might actually be just train a model on just some sound bites that you have, and you don't lose your voice as it's done before. And that also adds an interesting angle, because it's important to understand that it's not only video, but it's also the audio angle that deepfakes can kind of cover.
Absolutely. I think, for example, I believe a British woman who was on a game show, who then lost the ability to speak, a company used that recording of that game show and her speaking on that to recreate her voice. And she said it was the most moving experience. And by extension, Stephen Hawking was offered actually a more personalized voice to what he used to sound like. But at that point, he said, "No, this is my personal brand, and I want to keep this kind of American robot voice." But had he been losing his voice at this stage in his life, in this day and age, we may well have had a very different version of Stephen Hawking. But I guess the other kind of uses, which I think are particularly kind of society beneficial, I think is things like art. A lot of artists are doing what's called generative art, which is using artificial intelligence and these kinds of algorithms that deepfakes frequently utilize to create new forms of expression and kind of co-creation with algorithms. And I think that's a really kind of interesting space where artists are really pushing the boundary of what we think art to be using these tools. I think one other brief example also is people using deepfakes in things like advocacy. So, for example, there's a famous campaign now which was created when David Beckham spoke using synthetic lip synchronization several languages about to raise awareness of malaria. And similarly, there have been campaigns done where people have been synthetically resurrected. A journalist who was murdered in Mexico was synthetically resurrected to demand justice for other journalists in the same position, which is controversial, but I think the overall message is quite powerful. So those are some of the really positive kind of societally beneficial use cases, I guess you could say. On the commercial side, I think the potential is endless, really.
Just to hone in a little bit on this side before we move to the commercial side, what does deepfaked art look like? I mean, you painted a picture in my head when you mentioned that before, but what is that? I mean, it seems to be like with all the NFTs, the non-fungible tokens, and now with deepfakes, there seems to be a revolution hitting the art scene. But I can't really picture what you had in mind there.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I'm perhaps somewhat more skeptical about NFTs, although maybe that will come back to haunt me. But there is a company that is now offering deepfake NFTs. I think they're called Alethea AI, which is an interesting concept. I'm sure they've got some interested clients. But yeah, I mean, generative art involves things like, for example, providing a data set to an algorithm and kind of intentionally providing some sort of distorting data to see how it impacts the result that's generated. One which was particularly controversial, someone trained a image generating network on pornography for a piece called The Machine Gaze, where this machine spat out synthetic pornography from the kind of the angles that pornographers use. And it was kind of his commentary on how pornography really distorts what it is, what sex is, and kind of how, I guess, it dehumanizes people and how machines can create this. There are other studies but there are other projects, hundreds to be honest. It's a huge space, really growing, where people are just using lots of different forms of generative neural networks and feeding them strange data or intentionally polluting that data set to see what comes out. And someone did one with deepfakes, I think, recently of drag artists, and kind of you could customize these different deepfakes of drag artists, which was a really interesting use. So yeah, it's a huge space, much bigger than I think many people would think. But if you search generative art, people like Luba Elliott, a guy called Shardcore, they both create some really interesting examples that I always enjoy seeing on my Twitter timeline.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I find this so interesting is that we see the 21st century is changing a lot of job descriptions. And maybe one job description that I thought in my maybe unknowing mind was that it should be very durable is that one of an artist. But now that if you're a data scientist, you don't have to work for Google or Facebook. You can also be an artist. That's something super interesting. And yeah, I'm excited to see where this is going. But you also teased at the commercial use cases of deepfakes. I'm really interested to learn, what are companies looking into?
Yeah, so I think, to be honest, at this stage where synthetic media, and I think that's another thing that's worth just briefly mentioning, is that, a lot of commercial entities will talk about synthetic media rather than deepfakes to avoid that negative connotation. But I think when it comes to synthetic media, commercial uses are the main driving force behind a lot of developments now, actually. I think a lot of the bigger companies like Adobe, like Nvidia, are looking at this and saying this is the future of VFX, really, and are developing increasingly powerful and sophisticated tools for image and video editing, where the click-by-click process of an editor is perhaps replaced by automated algorithms. Or algorithms rather, that automate what would have typically been a complex click-by-click, frame-by-frame process. But to give it in broad strokes, I mean, when you're looking at the entertainment industry, you're looking at synthetically, as I mentioned in the case of advertising or advocacy, synthetically resurrecting deceased actors to act in films from beyond the grave, so to speak. We're talking about, having body doubles where people or actors are then face swapped in so that they're associated with a film and their likeness is used, but they don't have to actually act it themselves. We're talking about using text generating models like OpenAI's GPT-3 to create highly convincing dialogue for characters in video games so that you don't get the same lines over and over again, but you have a procedurally generated set of new dialogue so that the game never gets boring. We're talking about, in advertisers, synthetically editing in new synthetic speech into adverts so that you can publish the same advert in multiple different countries and have it customized without having to refilm that same advert again and again for different languages. There are so many different use cases, particularly with regards to things like advertising and marketing. We've seen quite a few examples already of that. We've seen Mountain Dew synthetically resurrect Bob Ross painting a Mountain Dew bottle for an advert. We've seen in Spain and in a couple of countries now, actually, yes, dead actresses and famous artists being resurrected to advertise things like beer and in some cases Turkish petrol stations. We've seen with an HBO documentary for The Last Dance, which is a documentary on, I think, the Chicago Bulls' famous season. They created a deepfake of the famous sports presenter who was, around at that time saying, something along the lines of, I predict that this is going to be a season that they make a documentary about called The Last Dance in the future. And so there are many different uses like this. I think one thing that I would say is right now, a lot of the uses are quite novelty, right? They're really relying on the deepfake, which is disclosed and clearly a deepfake, to kind of shock and kind of, engage the audience. The future of this space for me is where deepfakes and synthetic media just are used seamlessly and blend in. So, one company, I think called Veritone, recently announced an entire platform they've launched where celebrities can license their voice for adverts on podcasts. So you could get, Angelina Jolie to license her voice, and it goes into a bank of synthetic voices that then, a product can say, we want to do an advert with her synthetic voice, to which she says, yeah, okay, fine, you pay me a royalty. And then her synthetic avatar voices the advert or endorsement.
That is incredible, Henry. I mean, if you think about that, that changes kind of the concept of advertising, right? I mean, if Angelina Jolie would have gotten a gig and to create a podcast advertising for a bank, then she would have had to go into the sound booth, had to kind of rehearse her lines and then say that and do a couple of takes, and then it takes forever. And then you kind of post-produce it and that's it. But now you're saying, wait a minute, we just need we have to train a model to kind of have Angelina's Jolie's voice on file. And then you can just use that for 20, 30 different advertisements and all over the world. And might even use that for, a language in the Chinese language or whatever, or in German or in Sweden, to be even more relatable, and just have Angelina Jolie chill in her mansion in Beverly Hills, wherever she lives, and that's it. And she gets a nice little check at the end of the month. So that's a really interesting concept.
Yeah, I mean, I think people talk about a side hustle and needing passive income these days, right? I think that's a form that's quite perhaps quite enviable for some people. Although, as you said, it's going to change the advertising industry. In fact, it already is. But it's also potentially going to change what it means to have a celebrity endorsement. I mean, there is a chance that having such a potential saturation of this person's presence, whether it's synthetic or real, could water down what it means to have an endorsement. And indeed, there are people, myself included, who are already questioning whether these things, these synthetic advertisements, these synthetic voice endorsements should be disclosed, and it should be something that the audience is keenly aware is not the actual Angelina Jolie or the actual Leonardo DiCaprio, if it's in a film, for example, but is actually a synthetic double. And I think that there's some really key questions there around kind of authenticity in the age of synthetic media and deepfakes, which are, they apply to a lot of different use cases. But the baseline is kind of, do we as kind of consumers have a right to know when we are consuming digital content which isn't a real person? And indeed, this is a question that was raised in regards to Google as well, when they released back in 2018 their Google Duplex voice assistant, which is essentially a voice assistant where you can say, hey, Google, make an appointment for me to get a haircut, which I desperately need right now, at this time at this place. And then the voice assistant will ring that hairdresser and say, hey, can you book an appointment for so-and-so at this time? And when they first demoed this, they were kind of boasting about how realistic it was, how it fooled, the audience. And then the feedback from that was, this is unethical. This is kind of an incredibly bad taste. And, people deserve to know when they're being spoken to by a robot. And then, they retrospectively said, okay, we'll label this now. We'll announce that you're talking to a synthetic voice. But I think it really hinted at this kind of dynamic, which is companies are really excited about this new technology. Sorry, I repeat that. Companies are really excited about this new technology. They really want to get it out there. They want to deploy it and they want to monetize it. But often they perhaps miss out on those ethical considerations, which are quite important when it comes to introducing a new technology. And indeed, again, that's kind of where that philosophical mindset is quite important. It's how is this going to change our world in ways we don't necessarily have the ability to forecast properly right now. And I think the commercial use is in an area where that's particularly important.
I remember what the example that you bring up, the Google Duplex. I worked for the Google Assistant at the time, back when I was still working at Google. And that was a really interesting discussion also, because there's one thing, I think it's called the Turing test, which is, when is a computer actually able to impersonate a person and, convince another human being that it's not a machine, but it's actually another human being. And some opinions out there said that, Google actually passed the Turing test there. And I remember the discussions that this triggered, and they all feed into this discussion of deepfakes. Another angle that I find so interesting about what you're saying, Henry, is when I look at the how advertising is developing. Obviously, advertising is one of the biggest industries out there. You just have to look at the market capitalization of Facebook and Google. And basically what Google and Facebook are trying to do, they're trying to optimize how should I say it? They're trying to optimize the likelihood of anyone seeing an advertisement to like it, to think that it's important for you, that it has relevance, and to potentially click on that advertisement and maybe potentially see value and then purchase the product. So it's all trying to generate relevance for you. And the way that you can do that is obviously, a couple of decades ago, you had a TV advertisement which just targeted the whole of the UK, and you just had one advertisement for crisps or for beer. And now this gets a lot more differentiated, and you can target different regions, you can target with different messaging, depending on, maybe if you have a kid, you might consume a beer different than if you're a college student. So you can have different messages. And what you're saying is only a logical continuation of this trend of customization and personalization also in the advertising industry, which does not have to be limited to audio, as we discussed with the Angelina Jolie example, but could also be a synthetic production of video material, of images based on some input factors, which could very well be the living conditions of someone, the marital status, the income that someone has. And this offers probably a ton of commercial applications to the advertising industry.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure, yeah, from your experience at Google, which, as you said, is one of the biggest advertising companies in the world. I'm sure you know much more about that side of things than me. I mean, I guess recently I have read at least some early signs that targeted advertising is not as effective as some people once thought in terms of actually converting to sales. But I think what you're talking about in terms of customizing content itself. For people is very interesting, especially when it comes to more marketing, perhaps, and direct advertising. So, for example, Lay's, the crisp brand owned by PepsiCo, released a campaign recently where basically you could create a personalized message for your friends delivered by Messi, the football player. Where you could kind of put in your friend's name and you could put in a couple of details, and then using this lip synchronization and it could create this customized message for your friends. And I think that was something that was quite successful precisely because it allowed that customization, as you say. In other contexts, there are already sort of some kind of, perhaps in my opinion at least, more dystopian ideas of advertisers personalizing themselves to you by putting your face on the body of the person wearing those clothes or in that experience, and obviously huge questions there about consent, and things like influencing children and things like this. But I think in terms of customizing bespoke content, deepfakes provide a whole nother level, and also advertising to new markets like Gen Z. There are entirely synthetic influencers, these entirely synthetic digital people who, such as Little Markella, who has got millions of followers on Instagram and who partners with some of the biggest brands in the world to advertise stuff. And I think this is, again, feeding into this changing attitude of younger people who are increasingly more comfortable with synthetic and digital media as part of their day-to-day life, and where perhaps, we maybe had Tony the Tiger advertising Frosties when we were younger. Having a synthetic, realistic avatar of a real person is now the future of advertising to younger generations. So I think yes, advertising by far and away is one of the most interesting areas. But certainly entertainment, film, TV. For example, in France, an actress was ill with COVID, and so instead of stopping the production, they just got a body double in and face swapped her into the scene. There is an entirely new film being commissioned with James Dean as the lead actor. Obviously, he's dead, so that's going to be an entirely synthetic version of James Dean.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So, these are going to become increasingly prominent aspects of our media ecosystem, of TV, of film, of even potentially music. Again, music videos have been released using deepfakes too. And I think, as I said, these are not, I wouldn't say explicitly positive, societally beneficial use cases, but they're certainly innovative from a commercial perspective. And I think, as I said, the commercial angle is actually one of the biggest driving forces behind the adoption and growing accessibility of this technology. Some companies, such as Synthesia, which is a London-based company who focus on synthetic lip synchronization, particularly for things like marketing materials, they have a very kind of professional approach. You have to get explicit consent from all parties involved. They generate very high-quality outputs and are very selective about their clients. Other companies, perhaps not so much. And that's where the problems perhaps start to emerge if this technology isn't developed responsibly.
Yeah, I can imagine. Before we move on to because you already tease out some of the negative, also the moral questions of deepfakes, and we're going to talk about that. I just have to ask you one question. I remember, so sometime once a year, basically, I do kind of a theory podcast with one of my friends or some people that I just enjoy talking to, and we kind of try to predict the future. And the last time we did it was with Yosha on 2030, and I believe it was one of my predictions when I said that I try to envision the entertainment, especially the movie landscape in the year 2030. And by looking at the question, I kind of thought, movies, especially blockbuster movies, are an extremely bad bet for movie companies because they cost a ton of money, and it's not a very iterative approach. Either they're a hit, or and you earn their money back and a bit more, or they're a huge money hole because they cost like $100 million production or even way more. So one way out of this dilemma that movie companies face would be, well, why don't we tailor movies more to the person watching the movie? Because if you think about it, the way that we described the advertising industry in the past, it was one advertisement for the whole of the UK or the US or Germany, and you had to kind of, well, like the ad or not, but advertisement has evolved since then. The same has not happened to movies yet. So I'm wondering, is deepfakes actually a portal to customize movies more to individual people watching them? Maybe, maybe I'm the guy who likes comedy a bit more, so the goofy sidekick comic relief character gets a bit more screen time in my version. And if you like, I don't know, the action packed, then your explosions are even brighter, and there's even one more car crash in the storyline that you have. So I'm just trying to, I'm trying to envision, is this something that Hollywood is looking at, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting prediction. Certainly one that I think at least aspects of it are certainly being explored by studios. I think, when you think about platforms such as, in particular, Netflix and Amazon Prime, who have so much data about watch time, about, viewer preferences, about how long you watch the trailer for before you skip, and build up these very complex profiles of viewers, I think that kind of data could certainly flow into the kinds of personalization you're talking about. And I think it's fair to say that big studios are very, very interested in synthetic media and deepfakes. I think Disney and Universal both lobbied the New York State, to avoid new laws that would restrict the use of deceased persons' image rights. So effectively to kind of control and regulate closer synthetic resurrection in film. And I think, I know from, again, people that I know in the industry who are working with people on these kinds of deepfake techniques, that yes, it is something they're increasingly interested in. I think there's a couple of things. I mean, I think one would be that to actually achieve the kind of prediction that you made is it would involve a lot of synthesis, right? So we're talking about potentially creating entirely new scenes synthetically. And that's not just changing perhaps someone's face. Maybe it could involve changing the lines, right? So synthetically changing the lip synchronization, synthetically replicating voice. But in certain cases, that could involve changing entire scenes. And so I think that would be technically very challenging to achieve, particularly if you're talking about very fine-grained customization based on individual preferences as opposed to, say, archetypes of viewers. But I think, there is definitely, I think, some exploration of these ideas in the Hollywood space. And I think you're certainly right that perhaps it's an innovation that studios will need to make to stay relevant and to avoid, as you said, kind of making big gambles on films which they don't really know how they're going to do until they're released, unless it's got an established brand behind it. But I do think that the kind of the inherent technical requirements that would be needed to do that well and to do it convincingly are still a long way off, right? I think most of these studios would rather not deploy it at all if it's got even the slightest kind of uncanny valley feel to it than to deploy it. They would rather deploy it later on once they've perfected that technique. If I'm being frank, I think 2030 might even be a bit early for that. But I think you may see some potential elements, for example, you could say maybe in the case, let's say, of China, where you have to occasionally, films get redacted or edited. Instead of taking out entire scenes or, blanking over certain bits, you might be able to change things more seamlessly to accommodate different audiences.
Yeah. What a wonderful British way of telling me, hey, Alex, you're way out of your head there. That's not going to happen. I love the way that you put that. That's great. Well,
I think you are, I put it this way, Alex, you are certainly thinking along the same lines as certain innovators in that space. I think is perhaps the time frame that I'm more skeptical of. But look, the changes we've seen in the last 4 years now are so rapid that maybe I'll be the one eating my hat in 2030 when we go see our own personalized versions of the new Pirates of the Caribbean film for the 20th time or something, right?
Yeah, totally. Well, I'm sure I'm sure your opinion is much more grounded in reality than mine is. But let's now turn to the negative side of synthetic media, of deepfakes, because that is certainly something that you can't avoid when talking about deepfakes. And I feel that this is something concerning many people, and all the articles that I read are, obviously focusing a bit on that angle. But well, you already mentioned a couple of different malicious ways of using deepfakes. You said that 96% of deepfake material is pornographic images. And you also mentioned that, it's actually being used to blackmail people. And I think you had a really interesting example of an audio clip of a CEO of a company that was being used to then call different people of that company and have money basically wired to a bank account. And do you see those kinds of things happening more more intensely, more rapidly, and to a bigger extent, or is that still kind of the little tip of the iceberg and some little things happening there, or is that widespread?
So currently, right now, a lot of the malicious uses outside of the context of intimate image abuse, sexual image abuse, are no way near as pronounced as I think some people think they are. And I think, it's important that we discuss the positive uses as we have done. I also think it's important to discuss these malicious uses because I do think they outweigh the potential positive uses. Not to say that means we should ban it, but I just think on a cost benefit analysis. But it's also important that your audience know what is really going on right now, because there is a tendency to fearmonger, to sensationalize what is currently available. For example, with the Tom Cruise deepfake, right? People were saying this is so easy. Deepfakes are here in this way, and we can never trust what we see, not knowing that there are really probably a handful of people again who could do that on that level, and it's by no means easy. I think the malicious uses are really important. In terms of where we are with them right now, the example you just mentioned about cybersecurity and fraud. So this is an interesting space because there's been one confirmed example by a company called Nisos, which is a US intelligence company. And they released a very short audio clip of someone saying, "Hi, so-and-so, I'd like to discuss a business deal with you." And it wasn't very convincing, and it was pretty crap audio quality. That could be potentially forgiven for saying, "Oh, well, this is a really bad line. It's super compressed, lossy kind of quality." But nonetheless, there have been other cases reported where, they've been synthetic voices have been allegedly used to impersonate CEOs to get them, as you said, to wire hundreds of thousands of euros or pounds to cyber criminals who are pretending to be a CEO of a subsidiary company, for example. But in those cases, the evidence has not been released. And actually, in some cases, there's skepticism, at least on my behalf, as to whether they actually involve deepfakes or not. And for if you're an insurance company or you're a cybersecurity company, it may be quite convenient to tell your potential customers that they should be worried about this and paying for your services, right? So, but having said that, the technology is, as I mentioned, improving rapidly. And there have been some interesting use cases, particularly actually surrounding cryptocurrency, where people have been allegedly impersonated using deepfakes, such as first-order motion models, which are quite crude. And again, the raw footage wasn't released, but there have been cases where deepfakes have been allegedly used in that capacity. So I think, cybersecurity is an area we definitely need to be very concerned about, not just in terms of fooling people, but also fooling biometrics. So there was a case in China in February, I believe, which reported in April, where Chinese scammers bought fake people, basically pictures of people, made a fake company, and then authenticated those people, I believe, on the tax returns claim by using first-order motion models to animate their face to fool liveness detection. And again, that resulted in, I think, tens of millions of dollars worth of money being taken illegitimately. And so, I think that's another area that biometric companies are very concerned about, is how synthetic voice audio, synthetic faces could be used to fool authentication for your banking systems or for your credit cards or stuff like this. I think it's a little bit away that perhaps synthetic voice audio is that good, and especially things like live facial reenactment. They have a long way to go to be good for fooling humans, but for machine systems, for biometrics, if you learn the weaknesses in that system, you might be able to get around that through adversarial attacks, as they're called. And then I think in terms of other malicious use cases, disinformation is obviously the key low-hanging fruit that a lot of people are scared about, right? We've seen how in the US elections and around the world, really, how manipulated media, which is cruder, what we call shallow fakes, already do a lot of harm. That could be a video taken out of context. It could be cut deceptively. It could be slowed down or sped up, or it could just be a really crude Photoshop job. These fool millions of people and can cause real world harm, as we saw with Nancy Pelosi when someone slowed down her voice audio to make her sound drunk, or as we saw with Jim Acosta when they sped up footage of him to make it look like he kind of aggressively pulled away from this White House reporter, and they revoked his pass for that. So I think the thinking here is, if we look at cases like that, if we look at countries in the developing world countries in the developing world where WhatsApp in particular is used to spread misinformation in a closed ecosystem with real world consequences, deepfakes are just going to add a massive barrel of fuel onto that fire. So far, they actually haven't really. Not in any case it's been really significant in its impact. I think that's partially because right now it's just easier to use these more traditional methods, right? The kinds of manipulations that deepfakes do well are currently not accessible enough that they can be done, really convincingly by the average person. And if you're a sophisticated bad actor, you're going to want to pick and choose your time to use your model, because as soon as you do, you know that you're going to have the world's intelligence services crawling all over you trying to figure out how you did it. So in the disinformation space, it's coming. It's almost certain it will be used, and we've seen hints of that. But it's not been deployed with great effect yet. What we've seen perhaps more potently being used, actually, and more insidiously perhaps, is just the very idea of deepfakes being used as a way to destabilize conversations. So as more and more people come to know about deepfakes, the more people come to think that things could be deepfakes. So deepfakes don't just make fake things look real, they make people aware that real things could be fake. And so that's being used increasingly to destabilize political processes in countries such as Gabon in Africa, and currently in Myanmar with a military coup, where videos of politicians which are real and deemed to be real by experts are increasingly decried as fake by opposition leaders or by activists, and result in real world kind of disruption, political unrest. We've also seen recently a case where a video of the Russian opposition Navalny, his essentially his head of staff. There was a claim that a deepfake of him was used to fool, several governments in the Baltic region and in the UK to talk to them on video calls. Turns out they weren't deepfakes at all, and the claim was being made wrongly that this was a deepfake. And again, it's this idea that the idea of deepfakes is destabilizing confidence in audiovisual media. We also saw an incredibly important case, which leads into another area of interest, which is legal processes. Recently, where a mum was accused of making deepfakes of her daughter's cheerleading rivals to try and get them off the team.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. That is, you have to tell us about that cheerleading scandal.
Yeah, so in this case, this was in Pennsylvania. A mum was charged, I believe, with cyber harassment. And the DA, the district attorney for Pennsylvania, stated that this cyber harassment was done with deepfakes of her daughter's cheerleading rivals, where she made it look like they were smoking a vape and drinking, and I think as well, allegedly, there were images of them naked or in the nude. the DA was claiming were deepfakes, were synthetically generated by this mum.
So he's claiming that is one very technically sophisticated mother who was able to. My mother would not be able to do that, but that was the claim. Okay, so they said, you know what, these cheerleaders are they're smoking, they're vaping, they're doing having pornographic images on the internet, and and to discredit those cheerleaders, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm good to see that your alarm bells were ringing as well, Alex, because as you said, for me, knowing what it takes to do those specific kinds of manipulations, for example, facial occlusion, having items going in and out of the mouth in the case of a vape, or the smoke from a vape going across the face, or the movements that would be required, having a glass coming up to your lips or something like this. Highly sophisticated manipulations that would require expert editing and likely post-production editing as well. So I was incredibly skeptical about this claim from the beginning. And it turned out after ABC released a report that contained the footage, it was just very clear that these videos were not deepfakes, and that this was a completely fake or misguided claim, I should say, by the DA and the officers involved in the case, which was just mindlessly parroted by the media who had picked up on the juicy story. And last week, after the preliminary hearing for this case, where this woman's lawyer pointed to my analysis of this case and an article by the journalist Mike Phelan, who did an excellent follow-up investigation, the DA basically dropped the claim that these were deepfakes. But I think as a kind of a cautionary tale, it's incredibly alarming to see that these key institutional elements of our society, right, the police and the law effectively, being so unable to cope with deepfakes as a concept and have so little critical ability to reflect on content and understand whether it's real or not. Mm-hmm. And this is a case where this woman has been very badly impacted, but imagine this was a murder trial. Imagine this was an accusation of terrorism. Imagine this was major fraud. Mm-hmm. There are only a handful of people in the world who are expert and analysts who could do the kind of manual forensic work to understand whether this stuff is definitively real or not. And as this technology evolves, it's going to be increasingly hard to get hold of them for those cases.
But what is so interesting, what I find so interesting about the things that you just said is that basically the truth is under attack from both sides. So some people are actually altering the truth and trying to make something appear that has not been there. Someone saying something, or someone being in a situation where they haven't been, or removing someone from a certain situation, having them say something that they haven't said. And on the other hand, there are people who who did something wrong, who have been caught on tape or on either a videotape or an audio tape, and they can say, you know what, don't believe it. This is fake. This is doctored. This is a deep fake. So you have to wonder what is the concept of truth in the future if everyone can throw shade at everything that that is out there. I mean, it's a reason why there is a saying in many languages. I've seen this with my own eyes. Right? You have that in German. You have that in English. That's something. Well, it has to be true. I've seen it with my own eyes. That's the ultimate kind of pinnacle of truth. If you've seen it with your own eyes, if you hear it from someone else, you might be skeptical. But if you see something with your own eyes, then it has to be true. So what is truth going forward? I mean, are we able to have a kind of truth, or is this actually something that there are alternative facts out there and all these concepts that we have heard about in the last 4 years? I mean, what's your take on this? I mean, this is a big question, but how do you make sense of it?
Yeah, no, you're right. It's a big question, and one that I think philosophically is very interesting. I mean, when you have people like Trump saying the grab them by the tape isn't real, that wasn't me, and Trump supporters saying his video condemning the Capitol rioters and saying that was a deep fake and that wasn't Trump, he would never say that. You realize, especially in our climate right now, as you said, with post-truth as a term that I try not to use because I think it's a bit cliched now, but a world where ideas of what truth is are increasingly fragmented, is increasingly concerning. I think, and as you said, seeing is believing. I saw it with my own eyes. Is very much a statement which I think perhaps in the digital age is less and less relevant. I think the conditions for truth don't necessarily change. Like the epistemic conditions aren't necessarily changing. I think what is changing is what is deemed to be sufficiently reliable evidence to make that claim. So if you say, I know something and I know it because I saw it, we think, well, what did you see? Did you see something directly through direct kind of experience, or did you see something mediated by digital media? And then I think the extension of that is like, how can you know that media was not manipulated? And that's something, again, which is increasingly difficult. And I guess, spoiler alert, deepfake detection is not necessarily the straightforward answer you would think. So I think, as I said, I don't think necessarily kind of the epistemic conditions for truth have changed as such. I think what we're seeing is the kinds of evidence that we draw on that are seen as definitive and almost unquestionable are increasingly falling away as our world becomes increasingly saturated by digital media, and the techniques that are available for editing digital media become increasingly powerful and sophisticated. I think the kind of question of what is truth and like what is the future of truth in this context, I think it is in a way as it always has been. I mean, I don't know about you, I've never seen Trump in the flesh. I've never seen Obama in the flesh. I've never seen Merkel in the flesh. I rely on that being mediated by trusted institutions such as news organizations, such as the media, and digital media. But increasingly, if we can't trust what we see directly in digital media, that puts even more pressure on those media organizations, news organizations, to do their due diligence on our behalf, right? To really make sure that their reporting is as accurate as possible. But again, unfortunately, as I'm sure your listeners know, that the decentralization of VFX and creative manipulation capabilities is just one of many forms of decentralization digital age has brought. And one of those is the decentralization of authority when it comes to current affairs and news. And as we see repeatedly, influencers and YouTube and Facebook and so on are increasingly where people get their news. And these are not held to the same standards, perhaps, as say CNN or the BBC or other publications like that. So what you have is kind of a perfect storm in a way of kind of the increasing fragmentation of kind of key institutions that provide kind of, I guess, trust and kind of checks and balances, at the same time that more and more people are going to be able to do incredibly sophisticated manipulations, into an ecosystem where the most far-fetched conspiracy theories are believed by an incredibly worrying number of people. So it's a very concerning confluence of different factors.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if you think about things like QAnon, right? I mean, those people have, or I mean, you can name any kind of conspiracy theory. It doesn't even have to be a conspiracy theory, but people make their own reality in a way, right? That's just the nature of people. For some people, they might be living 1 mile apart from each other, but they have totally different realities based on the people they speak to, the media they consume, and others. But this takes it to a whole new level of what as you mentioned, what truth is. So I mean, you have to ask the question: are you ever? I mean, you spend all day thinking about these things. Are you ever scared for the fabric of society when you see what could be done? And I'll give you 2 more examples of what we just talked about. I mean, you can think about this from a very major political perspective by thinking, when the Trump supporters stormed the Capitol, I mean, they had 2 things. They were holding on to 2 things. On the right hand, they had the American flag. On the left hand, they had their smartphone. So imagine a kind of a deep-faked video of Trump saying whatever, blow this place up or put fire to it. What would have happened, right? This is just because if you're in the moment and if you're emotional. And the other example is, I read a super cynical example, is I read that, I don't know if it actually happened, or if it was just kind of an example of what could happen, is that, it could be possible to hack into a hospital database and insert images of lung cancer into the scans of patients. And I think I read that on your Twitter page, quite frankly. So, I mean, you can have the big one, the big political example with Trump, but it could also be something as sinister as, having force people into operations that they don't need. So, I mean, it gets very real, even if you think, well, this doesn't really touch me, and I consume my media very selectively. So my question still stands this is a very long question, but do you ever lose faith in the future of society? And are you scared when you kind of think about these things?
Yeah. So perhaps, yeah. I mean, it's a question I've had a fair few times now from people who are like, how do you cope just constantly seeing all of these very subversive technologies being used in often quite sinister ways? I think, the example you mentioned about the lung cancer and inserting fake tumors into CT scans is a really interesting one, because I think, again, a lot of discussion of deepfakes, and to be fair, the majority of use cases are, but they normally talk about humans, right? It's about human voices, it's about human faces, human lips being changed. Whereas, as you quite rightly point out, synthetic media isn't just about those things. It's about, potentially introducing fake medical conditions, synthetically generating fake maps. Satellite imagery is another area which is of increasing concern for military actors. Hacking into kind of surveying materials to kind of say, well, there's no bridge here when there is, or there is a bridge here when there's not. Things like that could be significant to those kind of operations. I think in terms of what do I think about, how do I think about it? How do I cope with this idea that all of this technology is coming? I mean, the future will be synthesized, right? That's kind of my kind of cheesy phrase I like to say. Is that, this stuff isn't going away. This is going to happen. But I think if you look at the 20th century, and indeed the first 2 decades of the 21st century, the changes that we're dealing with on a frequent basis as human beings are just beyond anything we've ever experienced before, and we've managed to find ways to make it work. I think, for example, a lot of people talk about Photoshop, and sometimes I get people saying, this isn't such a big deal. Photoshop's been around for ages. And I'm like, but you don't realize how many people are still fooled by Photoshop, including me and probably yourself quite often. But nonetheless, we have found a way that when something is Photoshopped, typically we can get it fact checked or identified, but it still does do damage, right? It still does damage in terms of disinformation or misleading people. And deepfakes are an advance on that. So I guess what I feel is that, I know enough people working on solution approaches from different perspectives that I'm confident that we will find a way to manage this. And I hope a big part of that will be by encouraging responsible use of the technology in the commercial and societally beneficial uses to kind of set up, and this is something I've been working on, is kind of like almost like a code of conduct. And I know there are way more AI ethics frameworks out there than anyone could want. But I think this is an area where we do need to think about what does it mean to responsibly use synthetic media, and what are best practices that we can deploy to avoid people getting fooled by well-intentioned synthetic media and deepfakes, so that when the malicious ones come around, it's quite clear to know. And I do think a big part of that will be about authentication at source. So kind of cryptographically watermarking an image or video as it's taken on a camera chip or on your phone, and that way that you have that kind of benchmark for authentication. That's something Adobe's working on with the Content Authenticity Initiative. They're kind of developing an open standard like PDF, but for authenticating images and videos. I think that has a very important role to play moving forwards. I also think detection does have a role to play, albeit it's a much more challenging proposition because of the wide range of manipulations and different combinations of manipulation that can be out there. But I still think that obviously has a role to play as well. Updated legal frameworks, better media literacy, although media literacy is an inherently difficult thing to do well. It involves kind of, again, people who are interacting in good faith, which is difficult. But this is a roundabout way of saying that I think that we will find a way to make this work. And in a sense, we're going to have to. Do I think that this is going to happen before deepfakes cause some serious harm? If we look at human history and our much more reactive way of dealing with problems as opposed to proactive, I would say, unfortunately, no. I think that there are going to be a lot of people who are harmed by this, as there already have been in the case of non-consensual image abuse. we're talking tens, if not hundreds of thousands of women who have been targeted, and the trauma that causes cannot be understated. And unfortunately, it often is in these conversations. But I do hope, and I have hope from what I see from working with people every day, that there are people who are dedicating everything they've got to solving this problem. And I hope that, it will be about a societal attitude shift towards digital media, which may take time and maybe a bit bumpy, but hopefully doesn't involve a kind of overhaul of our entire society and digital ecosystem.
Henry, that was exactly what I needed. Just a little bit of sunlight on the horizon, because if you kind of concern yourself as a person who doesn't spend too much time also in, as you mentioned, the probably a blockchain backed authenticity token, whatever, then you kind of get swum up. You just lose yourself in this whole fake news, the kind of the spin and the acceleration that this has kind of experienced in the last couple of years. So you kind of get swamped, and you kind of feel, oh my God, are we actually going to a society where no one really knows what's happening, and you just only can trust maybe your family, and the rest is you're in kind of might be propaganda, because is that influencer really that Korean or Chinese girl, or is it actually a middle-aged man? That was another example that I've seen. Or maybe why don't we two develop 1 million influencers, and just send them on and produce synthetic media, and see which one actually sticks and resonates, and then just kind of monetize that influencer. So it's a really interesting topic, and we've only, even after talking for over an hour, only scratched the surface of this, and we could talk for way longer. But the rules of this podcast kind of dictate that we try to come to an end after some time, but I cannot leave you without the rapid fire questions that I ask all of my guests. Are you ready for some rapid fire questions?
I think I'm as ready as I'll ever be for a flood of probably poorly formed answers from me. So yeah, let's go.
Yeah, let's see. Okay. So first one, what is your favorite German word?
Oh, so my favorite German word I can't pronounce because it's the same as you guys being unable to pronounce squirrel, but I think it's Einschweißen.
Oh, which one? Say that again.
Squirrel.
Oh, yeah, Eichhörnchen. Oh, yeah, the German translation for, that's a really difficult one. Eichhörnchen, yeah, that's a tough one.
I also like Schmetterling because that's just awesome. It's the most metal sounding word before. But I think it's a bit of a cliche that everyone likes Schmetterling.
Everyone likes it, yeah. In my time in the US, everyone said Schmetterling is their favorite German word. It's a fun little word.
Last one would be Lieblingsfach, because we had to do a song at school which was Das ist mein Lieblingsfach, with Naturwissenschaften, Erdkunde, all of these different subjects. So that's very much embedded in my brain too.
There you go. I mean, we could have this conversation all in German. That was some perfect German words. Next question. How do you spend a perfect Sunday?
I would go for a good long walk in some very stereotypical, idyllic English countryside, ending with a couple of pints at a nice country pub. Probably go home and listen to some kind of crazy avant-garde music with some friends, and maybe do a bit of jamming. To some increasingly probably drunk friends who are probably asleep on the couch.
Our listeners can't hear it, but I can see the guitars in the background of your video. So I guess you're playing guitar.
Yeah,
that sounds fun.
Love to be outdoors. Love to spend time with friends on creative pursuits. It's always good fun.
Cool. Yeah. Imagine the following scenario. Imagine you had the power to kind of project one sentence or one little learning, one sentence about deepfakes into the minds of everyone in Germany and the UK. So just you write it down, and that gets kind of projected into the minds of every Brit and every German there is. What would you want to teach, or what would you want to plant in the heads of all those people?
Yeah, so I'm gonna slightly cheat here and borrow from my my colleague who I respect very much, Sam Gregory, from the organization Witness, whose phrase is "Don't panic, prepare." So I think what I would say is, when it comes to deepfakes, don't panic, prepare. Which is, we're not going to get anywhere if everyone's losing their minds about deepfakes and thinking that the apocalypse is here and that the World War III is going to happen from a Trump deepfake or a Biden deepfake. What we need is people to think about this carefully and sensibly and learn about it, become aware of what is happening now and what is coming, in a way that means that we're ready for what is coming, not losing our heads before it's here.
How do you decompress from thinking about all that stuff, what's going to happen in the future? I mean, you already kind of mentioned it a little bit, spending your perfect Sunday, but maybe there's something else too. Yeah,
I was going to say, actually, I said having drinks on a Sunday, and almost certainly that's going to mean I have a very unproductive Monday. So maybe that was more about a Saturday. So I'm a big fan of walking. I think kind of brisk walking with a podcast or with some music. Again, I'm lucky to be in some fairly nice countryside, given my proximity to London. So getting out in nature, getting that fresh air, getting the exercise in, and then sometimes, playing some music and doing some more light reading is always a nice way to kind of get it off the brain. But as with so many things, when you're looking at things that are complicated and disturbing, also talking with people, friends, family. I think we all perhaps underestimate, or maybe have realized during the pandemic, how important those people are to us.
Staying on the topic of music, what's your favorite song that you write your articles to?
Oh, God. So I have been listening to recently, perhaps something a bit unconventional for this, which is an album by a British jazz musician called Yusuf Days. And he's done a collaboration called the Yusuf Days Trio with a guy called Charlie Stacey and Rocco Palladino, who's the son of a very famous bass player, Pino Palladino. It is a frenetic, energetic, powerful piece of music, a live performance with some improvisation at the end. And it's the kind of thing that when you've had your morning coffee and you've got a big article ahead to write, it gives you that kind of energy, although perhaps for some people it's a bit all over the place. But for me, it works.
That's the kind of answer that just tells me, music. You're a big fan of music, because it's not Coldplay. You didn't say Coldplay. It was someone I've never heard.
No disrespect to Coldplay, but I like perhaps to be a little bit more challenged by my music.
Got it. Okay. On a scale from 1 to 10, how big of a role will state actors play in, kind of mitigating the threat of deepfakes?
That's a great question, and it's a difficult one to answer, because by their very nature, state actors will probably obfuscate how much they are working on this, potentially because they're not wanting to disclose their capabilities to bad actors, or precisely because they are potentially developing their own capabilities that they don't want people to know about. So far, as I mentioned, DARPA in the US are doing an incredible job organizing research on deepfakes and countermeasures. I think moving forward, the most sophisticated attacks will only be within the realm of state actors, and likely may be the case, such as in Russia, where they're proxy attacks, where state-sponsored hackers will do things on states' behalf. So I think heavily involved in solution approaches and in offensive capabilities.
Interesting, because I talked to the president of, information security, I guess. It's hard to translate that of Germany. And it was interesting. I also talked to him about deepfakes, and he was a bit, he didn't really disclose too much, but I can sense that it's certainly something on their radar. 2 questions left, Henry. Mm-hmm. Which book must our listeners read?
So I guess it's not particularly imaginative, given that I mentioned I study philosophy, but I think the book I would recommend is Bertrand Russell's A History of Western Philosophy. It's a true classic in terms of, giving a background on philosophy, which I think is something, again, that we desperately need in this day and age where changes are happening so fast. and we're increasingly untethered from the kind of monolithic power structures that people like Nietzsche spoke about. And you need to be able to think critically and think for yourself. And whilst, there are lots of Eastern philosophers and other philosophers that aren't mentioned in the history of Western philosophy, which have some really interesting things to say, it's one of the most powerful overviews of some of the most important ideas that humankind has had. So I think, everyone could do with some more philosophy in their life. And if you can deal with quite a hefty book by Russell, I think it's well worth a read.
Yeah, I can't believe you mentioned that book. It's one of those books I bought. I started to read, and I don't know why, but I bought it in English. And I'm either not that smart, or I just, overestimated what I can understand, how heavy the material I can understand in English. So I was struggling quite a bit. So it's quite a read.
One briefly, I'd say if you wanted something a bit lighter, which does a similar thing, I would say there's a book called Sophie's World, which is written by, I believe, it's a Scandinavian philosophy professor, and I forgive me for forgetting his name, but that's written for young adults, and it's a much more readable, perhaps light version of a similar thing to the history of Western philosophy. So there you go. If you need something a bit less dense, but Russell doesn't skimp on the details, which are fun.
That's true. Well, thank you, Henry, for advising something that might be a bit more in my wheelhouse. I truly appreciate it. Last question that I ask all of my guests on this show is, what is the best piece of advice you have ever received?
Yeah, so this one's a tough one. I always struggle because I've been fortunate to be given lots of good advice by people I respect and admire over the years. But I think I would have to go with one that my brother said, which is, the best investment you can make is always going to be in yourself. And that is, when people think about things like perhaps like a talking therapy, or, going and having an experience, or investing in something that makes them happy. I think a lot of people really forget that, those are investments in you, your personality, your future, and those people around you who love you and care about you and want to spend time with you. And I think, that's again something that ties into the philosophy again. It's this idea of improving yourself and becoming a better person, and striving to kind of achieve what Aristotle would have called like a self-actualization. And I think investing in yourself through whatever means that may be is something that we can forget in our fast-paced world, where we constantly think of the future and things ahead, and work and other pressures. But it's always worth just taking a step back and thinking about, am I doing this for me? And what can I do that makes me happy?
Wonderful, Henry. That was a truly interesting conversation into the topic of deepfakes. I couldn't have wished for a better guest on this podcast than you. We've talked about, the basic concept of deepfakes, the different variants that we see, the pros and the cons and the good sides and the bad sides. Also, we've talked about the future of our society and truth itself. Before closing it out with some rapid fire questions. So, Henry, I can only say thank you so much for coming on. You've been a fantastic guest, very insightful, and I wish you all the best for whatever you're up to coming. I sense that, you won't, there will be a lot of interest in what you're doing in the next coming years.
Let's hope so, Alex. Thank you for the great questions, and I'm sure if we did this again in a year, there'd be some very different answers and some very interesting applications that have emerged. So let's definitely keep in touch.
Maybe I'll have to pick you up on that. Okay. Thank you, Henry, and take care. Hier ist wieder Alex, und das sind meine 3 Learnings zum Thema Deepfakes. Erstens, was ist noch Vertrauen? In vielen westlichen Ländern gibt es das Sprichwort, das habe ich mit meinen eigenen Augen gesehen. Was aber, wenn man sich gerade nicht mehr auf seine eigenen Augen verlassen kann? Werden dann Medien eine größere Filterrolle bekommen? Also die FAZ sagt, was wahr ist und was nicht. Aber erfüllen die Medien diese jetzt eigentlich schon ausreichend, wenn ich sehe, wie viele Fake News auch verbreitet werden? Kann man diese Verantwortung einfach auf Facebook, Google und Co. übertragen, obwohl ihre Algorithmen ja häufig auch eher ein Teil des Problems sind, indem sie nämlich nicht das authentische nach vorne spülen, sondern das, was am meisten geklickt wird, was vielleicht auch am meisten schockt? Oder braucht es eine staatliche Antwort auf das Ganze? Besonders bei der staatlichen bin ich ein bisschen skeptisch, obwohl ich vor ein paar Wochen noch mit dem Präsidenten des Bundesamts für Sicherheit in der Informationstechnik gesprochen habe, Arne Schönbohm, der da deutlich optimistischer war. Aber es scheint mir, dass das Wort in jedem Fall, das Wort Vertrauen oder Trust in den nächsten Jahren ein wenig unter Beschuss stehen könnte. Zweitens, das erste Learning war ganz schön pessimistisch, aber vielleicht braucht es das gar nicht sein. In der Vergangenheit gab es immer wieder Untergangsprophezeiungen, wenn es einen technologischen Durchbruch gab. Es gab mal Experten, die von der Benutzung der Eisenbahn abgeraten haben, als diese erfunden wurde, weil der menschliche Körper diesem Tempo nicht würde standhalten können. Offensichtlich falsch. Und was passiert heute? Es gibt jetzt schon eine Reihe von Startups, die genau das Thema, nämlich Deepfakes, auch als Chance für ihre Geschäftsmodelle erkannt haben. Drittens, jede Technologie hat auch Vorteile. Henry und ich reden über einen Aspekt, der eher selten besprochen wird, die Vorteile und die Chancen von Synthetic Media, wie Deepfakes auch genannt werden. Hollywood könnte dadurch ein Stück weit revolutioniert werden, wenn Filme mit toten Schauspielern neu gedreht oder völlig neue Szenen eingefügt werden könnten. Auch die Werbung könnte revolutioniert werden, wenn einzelne Werbemessages oder der Celebrity, der diese Botschaft überbringt, durch eine künstliche Intelligenz ausgewählt und produziert werden könnte. Das war's erstmal zu diesem faszinierenden Thema Deepfakes. Ich hoffe, du teilst ein Stück von meinem Enthusiasmus für dieses Thema. Die nächste Folge Digitale Optimisten gibt es wieder in 2 Wochen. Bis dahin wünsche ich dir alles Gute und bleib gesund.